December is a time for warmth, joy, and holiday traditions. But not every story this season is merry. In the cold, quiet nights of winter, darkness creeps closer, and the snow-covered world hides horrors that most will never see. Tonight, we'll uncover 5 true December horror stories, tales of fear, loss, and the unexplainable that will make you question the season's cheer. So, turn down the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, and prepare for a journey into the terrifying unknown. But beware! Not every tale has a happy ending. The snowstorm began without warning, a blinding fury of white that erased the road ahead and buried any signs of civilization behind. Struggling to keep their car on the icy road, Alex gripped the steering wheel, heart racing. The GPS had long since lost signal, leaving them with nothing but the faint hope of finding shelter before nightfall. Through the swirling snow, a faint structure appeared on the side of the road. At first, Alex thought it was a mirage, the tricks of an exhausted mind desperate for refuge. But as they approached, the silhouette solidified. A cabin, weathered and sagging, yet standing against the storm. Alex parked haphazardly, stumbling out of the car into the biting wind. The cabin loomed larger up close, its wooden exterior battered and blackened, as though by time or fire. The windows were dark, but the door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as though inviting them in. "Hello?" Alex called, their voice swallowed by the wind. No response. Desperation overruled caution. They pushed the door open and stepped inside, relieved to be out of the storm. The interior was freezing but strangely intact. A layer of dust coated the furniture. A small table, 2 chairs, and a couch that looked older than Alex's grandparents'. A fireplace sat in the corner, its charred logs long since burned out. On the mantel above it, a leather-bound journal sat, its edges cracked with age. Alex hesitated before picking it up, flipping through the yellowed pages. The handwriting was erratic, the words scrawled as if written in a panic. "If you've found this, you're already in danger." A chill unrelated to the cold crept up Alex's spine. They read further. The entries detailed a harrowing series of events. Travelers stranded in storms like Alex had found the cabin, only to realize too late that they were not alone. The last entry, dated decades earlier, sent shivers through their body. "It's still here, watching." A sudden creak from the floorboards behind them made Alex spin around, heart hammering. Nothing. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of the wind outside. As the hours passed, Alex tried to make themselves comfortable. They piled the dusty cushions onto the couch and wrapped a blanket they found over their shivering frame. Sleep didn't come easily. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room, and faint scratching noises echoed from the walls. When Alex finally drifted off, it was to the sensation of being watched. They woke to darkness. The fire had gone out, though Alex couldn't remember lighting it. The cabin was utterly silent now, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears. And then, a whisper. It wasn't a voice so much as a suggestion, like the rustling of leaves in a dead forest. Alex sat up, clutching the blanket, their eyes scanning the room. The journal had fallen to the floor, its pages open to a section they hadn't read. Crawling on their hands and knees, Alex reached for it, their breath clouding in the cold air. "It comes closer when you're not looking." The scratching started again, louder this time. It came from the window, a rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape that sent Alex scrambling backward. They grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the glass. There was nothing. The scratching stopped, only to start again at the door. Alex's breath hitched. They crept closer, their every instinct screaming to stay put. The flashlight beam trembled as they pointed it toward the door. The handle turned slowly, creaking. Alex froze, unable to breathe. The door swung open with a violent gust of wind, but nothing entered. Only the storm outside greeted them. Heart pounding, Alex slammed the door shut and locked it, throwing a chair against it for good measure. When they turned back to the room, the shadows seemed deeper, almost alive. They decided to leave, storm or not. Gathering their belongings, Alex opened the door to a shocking sight. The snow-covered landscape was gone. The car was gone. Instead, an endless black void stretched before them, the storm swallowed by nothingness. They stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door. The journal lay on the floor, and Alex grabbed it, frantically flipping through the pages. A passage near the end caught their eye. "It traps you here. Time means nothing. There is no escape." The shadows around the room began to coalesce, pooling in the corners and stretching along the walls. The scratching sound returned, now inside the cabin, circling Alex like a predator stalking its prey. Panicked, they shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The only response was laughter, soft, mocking, and inhuman. Alex backed into the corner, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The shadows moved closer, their forms vaguely humanoid but wrong, their edges flickering like flames. The journal fell from Alex's hands as the darkness engulfed them. Months later, a pair of hikers discovered the cabin. They found no trace of Alex, only the journal, lying open on the floor. The last entry was written in a trembling hand. "It's still here, watching." The December night was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seeped into bones and refused to leave. The sky was a canvas of dark gray clouds, and the snow-covered ground reflected the moonlight with an eerie glow. The four of them, Josh, Mia, Carter, and Liz, stood at the edge of Blackwood Cemetery, their breath visible in the freezing air. "This is stupid," Liz muttered, hugging herself. "Why do we always have to do these dares?" "Because it's fun," Josh replied, grinning as he pulled his phone out to record. "Besides, it's tradition. You can't have a December break without a little scare." Mia rolled her eyes but said nothing, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as they pushed open the rusted gates. Blackwood Cemetery was infamous in their small town, a sprawling abandoned graveyard with a crumbling church at its center. People whispered about strange lights and ghostly figures spotted among the tombstones, but no one ever stayed long enough to confirm. The dare was simple: make it to the church, ring the bell, and get out. The path through the cemetery was treacherous, the snow obscuring uneven ground and broken headstones. The wind howled softly, carrying with it an unnatural silence that settled heavily over the group. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, distant owls, were absent. "Do you hear that?" Carter stopped abruptly, his flashlight pointed toward the church in the distance. "Hear what?" Josh asked, spinning around. "Bells," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. Liz frowned. "That's impossible. The church hasn't been used in decades." But then they all heard it, a faint, melodic tolling that carried on the wind. It was soft, almost inviting, yet there was something unsettling about it, like a sound that didn't belong in this world. "Someone's already here," Mia suggested, though her voice wavered. "Maybe another group doing the dare?" Josh shook his head. "No one's stupid enough to come out here except us. Let's go check it out." Reluctantly, the group moved forward, the bells growing louder with each step. The church loomed ahead, its Gothic spires silhouetted against the night sky. The closer they got, the more unnatural the air felt. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind seemed to whisper incomprehensible words. The church door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and damp stone. Their flashlights illuminated rows of crumbling pews and a shattered altar at the far end. The source of the bells, however, was nowhere to be seen. "There's no bell tower," Liz pointed out, her voice trembling. "But we all heard it," Carter insisted, shining his flashlight upward. The ceiling was intact, but there were no ropes, no mechanisms, nothing to explain the sound. Mia's gaze fell on a staircase leading down into the crypt. "Maybe it's coming from below." Josh grinned nervously, But the fear in his eyes betrayed his bravado. "Guess we're going down." The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended, their flashlights barely piercing the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder, and the smell of rot intensified. The crypt was small, with a handful of sarcophagi lined against the walls, their stone lids covered in ancient symbols. The bells stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against their ears like a physical force. "We should leave," Liz whispered, taking a step back toward the stairs. Before anyone could respond, the lids of the sarcophagi began to shift. It started as a faint scraping sound, but then the lids slid completely off, crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. "What the hell?" Josh started, but his words caught in his throat. From the open tombs emerged figures draped in tattered, decaying robes. Their faces were hidden beneath shadowed hoods, but their skeletal hands and the unnatural way they moved made it clear they were not alive. "They're not real," Carter stammered, backing away. "This is some kind of sick prank." But then one of the figures turned its hooded face toward him, and beneath the fabric was not a skull, but a void, an abyss of endless darkness. The figure raised a bony hand and pointed at Carter. The bells resumed, louder now, echoing through the crypt with a malevolent rhythm. "Run!" Mia screamed, bolting for the stairs. The group scrambled up the staircase, the figures moving faster than seemed possible, their movements jerky but swift. Liz tripped, and one of the creatures grabbed her ankle with a claw-like grip. Her scream echoed in the crypt as the others pulled her free, dragging her up the stairs. Back in the church, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the building. The group pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. The bells rang louder, the sound filling their heads, drowning out their thoughts. One by one, they turned to face the figures emerging from the crypt, their hooded forms growing taller, more menacing. Josh dropped his phone as the tallest figure raised its hands, the bells stopping abruptly. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "You heard the call. Now you belong to us." The flashlights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Josh saw before the light disappeared completely was the figure's hood lowering to reveal a face made entirely of swirling shadows, a void that seemed to consume the very air around it. When the townspeople found the church days later, there was no trace of the four friends. Only Josh's phone remained, its camera frozen on a single image. The four of them standing in the crypt, smiling at the camera, with hooded figures looming behind them. The night was silent, the kind of stillness that felt wrong. Snow blanketed the world outside, muting every sound, while the faint glow of Christmas lights blinked lazily in the window. Sarah sat in the living room, staring at the fire that had burned down to embers. It had been a long day, and her 6-year-old son, Danny, had gone to bed hours ago. As she sipped her tea, Sarah heard a sound, a faint, tinny melody. She froze, the mug halfway to her lips. It was Silent Night, the soft, haunting tune drifting from somewhere upstairs. Her blood ran cold. She knew that song, The Music Box. Sarah placed her mug down carefully, her hands trembling. She hadn't touched that music box in years. It had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed it down before her death. After Danny had developed an inexplicable fear of it, Sarah had tucked it away in the attic, far from sight. But now it was playing. Heart-pounding, she climbed the stairs, her steps slow and deliberate. The melody grew louder as she approached Danny's room. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly. "Danny?" she called, but the bed was empty. Panic seized her chest as she scanned the room. The window was open, snowflakes drifting inside and settling on the floor. The curtains swayed gently in the frigid breeze. On the nightstand, the music box sat, its lid open, the little figurine of a ballerina spinning slowly. Sarah grabbed the music box and slammed the lid shut, silencing the melody. "Danny!" she screamed, running to the window and looking out. Small footprints led away from the house, vanishing into the darkness of the snow-covered woods. Grabbing her coat and boots, she bolted outside, flashlight in hand. The freezing air burned her lungs as she followed the tracks, calling Danny's name. The woods were eerily quiet, the beam of her flashlight bouncing off gnarled branches and untouched snow. The footprints seemed too perfect, almost deliberate, as if they had been placed with care rather than made by a running child. "Danny!" she shouted again, her voice cracking with desperation. The footprints led deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. The flashlight flickered, and Sarah slapped it, her breath fogging the air in rapid bursts. Ahead, she spotted a faint light. Relief washed over her as she quickened her pace, the light growing brighter. But as she neared, her stomach churned. The light came from an old cabin, one she didn't recognize. It wasn't supposed to be here. The footprints led straight to the cabin's door, which stood slightly open. A warm, flickering glow spilled out, accompanied by the faint sound of Silent Night, the same haunting tune from the music box. Sarah hesitated. Something about the cabin felt wrong, unnatural, but her maternal instincts pushed her forward. She stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. The interior was bizarre. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of children, their faces blurred or scratched out. A fire roared in the hearth, but there was no warmth, only a deep, penetrating cold that made her teeth chatter. In the center of the room stood Danny, facing away from her, his small frame illuminated by the firelight. "Danny!" she cried, rushing toward him, but as she reached out, he turned. It wasn't Danny. The face staring back at her was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly. The thing wore Danny's pajamas, but its features twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't belong to her son. "Mommy," it said, its voice high-pitched and mocking. Sarah stumbled backward, her scream caught in her throat. The thing took a step toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Where is he?" Sarah demanded, tears streaming down her face. The thing tilted its head, its smile widening impossibly. "He's with us now!" The fire roared higher, casting the room in an unnatural red glow. The photographs on the walls seemed to move, the scratched-out faces writhing beneath the frames. Sarah turned and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The thing laughed, a shrill, echoing sound that filled the cabin. "Give him back!" she screamed, pounding on the door. The laughter stopped abruptly. When she turned, the thing was gone. The cabin was empty, the fire extinguished, plunging her into darkness. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, until the music box began to play again. The tune came from the corner of the room where a small table now sat. On it was the music box, its lid open, the ballerina spinning. Next to it was a photograph. Sarah approached slowly, her hands trembling. The photograph was of her and Danny, but his face had been scratched out. Beneath it, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "You shouldn't have followed." The cabin door creaked open, revealing the endless expanse of snowy woods. Sarah stepped outside, the photograph clutched in her hand. Danny's footprints were gone, replaced by dozens of others. Small, childlike prints that circled her and led back toward the house. When she returned home, the music box was on the nightstand again, its lid open, playing its haunting melody. Danny's room remained empty. The wind whipped fiercely against the house, rattling the windows and howling through the cracks like a mournful wail. It was the dead of winter, and Ethan had grown used to the isolation of his remote home. After his wife passed a year ago, he'd retreated to this place to grieve in solitude, far from the sympathetic eyes of neighbors and friends. But the solitude came with its own price. Ethan sat in his armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the frost-covered window at the expanse of snow stretching into the darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the porch lantern, illuminating the yard just enough to see the endless white, and the man standing in the snow. Ethan blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light or his tired eyes. But the figure didn't disappear. It stood motionless, facing the house, dressed in ragged clothing barely suitable for the freezing temperatures. The man's face was pale, unnaturally so, with a frozen grin that seemed more like a grimace. Frost clung to his hair and eyebrows, and his unblinking eyes seemed to bore into Ethan through the glass. "Who the hell?" Ethan muttered, setting down his glass and standing. He opened the door, the icy wind hitting him like a slap, and shouted into the night, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move. Ethan hesitated, the sharp cold biting at his skin, then stepped out onto the porch. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. Ethan's breath fogged the air as he descended the steps, boots crunching in the snow. The man remained eerily still, his grin never wavering. When Ethan was about 10 feet away, he stopped. Something was wrong. The man's grin wasn't natural. His lips were cracked and frostbitten, the skin around them a sickly blue. His eyes were glassy, lifeless, but somehow still locked onto Ethan. "Sir, if you're in trouble, I can—" Ethan began, but the words died in his throat as the man suddenly tilted his head, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Ethan stumbled back. "Stay there!" The man's grin widened, impossibly so, the corners of his mouth splitting as bloodless cracks formed in his cheeks. His head tilted further, almost horizontal, before snapping back upright. Ethan bolted for the house, his heart pounding. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his breath coming in panicked gasps. He pressed his back against the door, listening. The wind screamed, but nothing else. He peered out the window again. The man was gone. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind made him jump. When dawn finally broke, he ventured outside, armed with a heavy flashlight. The spot where the man had stood was undisturbed, no footprints in the snow. He tried to convince himself it had been a hallucination, maybe the whiskey playing tricks on him, but deep down, he didn't believe it. That night, as darkness fell, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He kept the curtains drawn and all the lights on, but the oppressive silence outside seemed to seep into the house. Around 3 a.m., the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Ethan fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling, and shined it toward the window. The man was back. This time, he was closer, standing just beyond the porch steps. His grin was wider, his face more frostbitten, as if he'd been standing in the cold for years. Ethan's flashlight flickered. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing directly at Ethan. The flashlight went out. Panic gripped Ethan as he scrambled to relight it. When the beam finally flickered back on, the man was gone. A sudden pounding on the front door made him drop the flashlight. It wasn't a knock, it was a heavy, deliberate thud, as though someone were throwing their entire weight against the door. Ethan grabbed a poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "Go away!" he yelled, but the pounding continued, each thud rattling the door on its hinges. And then, just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Ethan crept toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay back. He leaned against it, listening. Something scratched against the wood. Slow, deliberate. He bolted for the kitchen, grabbing his cell phone, but there was no signal. The landline was dead. The scratching turned to tapping, soft and rhythmic. Ethan realized it was coming from the window now. He turned slowly, his stomach sinking. The man was there, on the other side of the glass, his face pressed against it. His grin was gone now, replaced by an expression of pure malice. His breath frosted the glass, but his eyes burned with an unnatural light. Ethan dropped the phone and backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The man's hand reached up, tapping a finger against the glass, and then he whispered, though the sound carried clearly into the room, "You let me in." Ethan screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a chair, and hurling it at the window. The glass shattered, and the freezing wind rushed in, but the man was gone. The next morning, Ethan was found by a neighbor who had come to check on him. The house was freezing, the front door wide open. Ethan sat in his armchair, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard. His face was pale, his expression frozen in a wide, unnatural grin. Out in the snow, the neighbor spotted a single set of footprints leading away from the house. They didn't belong to Ethan. The air was crisp and biting, the snow crunching beneath Maria's boots as she walked down the desolate road leading to her family's cabin. She'd promised her parents she'd arrive before nightfall, but the short December days had other plans. Darkness had fallen quickly, and the only light came from her phone flashlight and the faint crescent moon above. Maria wasn't usually one to scare easily, but something about the night felt off. The woods on either side of the road were unnervingly quiet. No wind rustling the trees, no distant animal calls, just the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the eerie silence. She stopped walking and pulled it out, grateful for a distraction. It was a text from her mom. "Are you almost here?" Maria sighed, typing back quickly. "Yes, 10 more minutes. The woods are creepy tonight, though." She waited for a response, but it didn't come. Shrugging, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued on her way. The cabin wasn't far, and she could already picture the warmth of the fireplace and the comforting chatter of her family. Another buzz. She paused again, taking out her phone. This time, the message wasn't from her mom. It was from an unknown number. "Who's walking behind you?" Maria froze. A chill ran down her spine, far colder than the winter air. Slowly, she turned around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The road behind her was empty, just an unbroken stretch of snow leading back to the highway. She laughed nervously, trying to shake the unease. It had to be a prank. Some local kid messing with her. She started walking faster, her boots crunching in a hurried rhythm. Another buzz. She hesitated but checked her phone. It was the same unknown number. "Don't turn around this time." Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around again, the beam of her flashlight trembling. Still nothing. Maria's heart raced as she quickened her pace, nearly jogging now. She debated calling her parents, but didn't want to seem paranoid. She told herself it was a coincidence, someone sending random texts to scare her. Then she noticed the footprints. In the snow beside her own tracks were others. Larger, heavier, and spaced too far apart to be human. They hadn't been there before. She stopped, her chest heaving, and shone her flashlight at the prints. They led up to the spot where she stood, then vanished. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the woods. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something large was moving just out of sight. Her phone buzzed again. Hands shaking, she looked at the screen. "Run!" Maria didn't think twice. She bolted, her flashlight swinging wildly as she sprinted down the road. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, and her feet slipped on patches of ice. Behind her, she heard it. Heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow, gaining on her. They weren't running, they didn't need to. Whatever it was fast enough just by walking. Maria's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, the cabin coming into view in the distance. The porch light was on, a beacon in the darkness. "Mom! Dad!" she screamed, but the words seemed swallowed by the night. The footsteps were right behind her now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent her heart plummeting into her stomach. She reached the cabin door, throwing herself against it and pounding frantically. "Open the door! Let me in!" The door swung open, and her dad pulled her inside, slamming it shut behind her. Maria, what's going on? He asked, his face pale with concern. There's something out there, she stammered, collapsing onto the floor. It was following me. Her dad grabbed a rifle from the corner and opened the door cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. Maria's mom knelt beside her, holding her tightly. Her dad came back moments later, shaking his head. Nothing's out there, he said. No tracks, no sounds, just the wind. Maria's stomach dropped. She knew what she'd heard, what she'd seen. Her mom tried to reassure her as they sat by the fire, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Later that night, as the family slept, Maria woke to a faint tapping at the window. She lay frozen in bed, her breath shallow. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a face staring in at her. It was pale, stretched unnaturally long, with hollow black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. It grinned, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Maria screamed, and her parents burst into the room, turning on the lights. But when they looked at the window, it was empty. Only her own footprints led up to the cabin, the snow otherwise untouched. The next morning, they found a message scratched into the wood of the cabin door. "I'll follow you anywhere.